Cannot believe we're already closing out our series, our beautiful series. Time goes fast when you're having fun. And quite appropriately, I think we're looking at beautiful restoration today. He restores all things. Ecclesiastes chapter 3 and verse 11, which is the theme verse for this series. He makes all things beautiful in His time. Restoration is about bringing something back to its original state. Sometimes even a better state. In other words, restoration presupposes that something is not as it should be. You can't have restoration without something first going pear-shaped. And when something goes wrong, when something hits the fan, then restoration can happen. You can't restore something that is already whole. God is in the restoration business. You might feel like your life has really had some hard yards to go through, some stuff that has ruined your dreams of what it could have been. You took some foolish turn. It may not have even been your fault, but still you find yourself in a situation that is not as you wanted to. There's a wreck of some sort. God is in the restoration business, and He restores beautifully. And as I read Scripture, so many times it appears as if restoration was always a part of God's plan. And He almost always follows a pattern. God will reveal something, then things can go almost into complete reverse. It looked like, Lord, I thought you said, and then things go backwards. And then God restores what went sideways. And so the first thing I want to look at this evening is instances of the reveal, reverse, and restore that we see in the Old Testament. It's all over the Old Testament. I can find about 4 or 5 examples just from the life of Abraham. I'm going to look at 1 or 2. First, the reveal. In Genesis 12, God reveals to Abraham a blessing that he will be made into a great nation. Then the reversal. 10 years go by, and instead of a nation, Abraham and his wife Sarah still don't have even one single son. One night, he pours out his heart to God in anguish and says, Lord, maybe I misunderstood you. Maybe this nation needs to come through Eliezer, my servant. And that's in Genesis 15. And Abraham interpreted God's delay as a denial. But it wasn't a denial at all. So then comes reveal number 2. God comes to Abraham and says to him, Eliezer won't be your heir. You will have a son. And through that son will come an uncountable number of sons and daughters, like the stars in the sky. Reversal number 2. Abraham and his wife wait another 15 years. Abraham is 100 years old. The book of Hebrews says that he was as good as dead. You know what that means? It means that all the ginseng and the horny goatweed in their back garden wasn't going to do a thing for them. That's what it means. Sarah is 90 years old. You know what that means? Sarah has grandchildren, knows grandchildren in the area who are going through menopause. Every new day was just another reminder to them that the situation was deteriorating more and more. And then comes the restoration. In Abraham and Sarah's physical state, God restores his promise by giving him a son, Isaac. In their old age, Sarah gives birth. And the story begins. God is so faithful. He will provide. Let's look at another situation with Abraham. Same reveal. The reveal is Isaac is to be the heir of a promised nation called Israel. The reversal. God comes and tells Abraham to kill his son and sacrifice him on an altar. Hebrews 11:19 tells us that Abraham reasoned that maybe God would raise his son back from the dead. So he was going to be obedient to what God had told him. And then the restoration. Just as Abraham is about to raise that dagger and kill his son, God stops him and provides a substitute sacrifice, a ram whose horns are caught in a bush nearby. And that becomes the sacrifice. And over again, we see this pattern of the way God works by revealing, reversing, and restoring. Reveal, reverse, restore. We see it in the life of Joseph. Trevor dealt with Joseph this morning. We see it in the life of Samson. We see it in the life of Moses. We see it in the life of Esther, and I could go on. Let me quickly look at David, the reveal. God, through the prophet Samuel, reveals that David, the most unlikely son of Jesse, will be the next king of Israel. I mean, Jesse, the father, doesn't even put David in the lineup. But there's the reveal. The reversal, things for David go completely backwards. He's sent back to his sheep. Not much of a job for a future king. He's employed in the service of Saul to play the lyre because it calmed Saul. And because of Saul's jealousy, he tries to kill David by throwing a javelin at him. But David escapes, and he goes into hiding in the wilderness just so that he can stay alive. That doesn't look like the career path of a future king. But then the restoration. God's revelation through Samuel is restored. And in 2 Samuel 5, David finally does become king. And David knew. He knew what restoration looked like. He wrote Psalm 23, verse 3. He restores my soul. He guides me in paths of righteousness for his name's sake. God is at work, always beautifully restoring in his time. He will restore what he has revealed. And nothing illustrates that stronger than my second point. Jesus beautifully restores. In Luke 4, Jesus goes into the synagogue and he reads from the scroll in Isaiah. And he quotes Isaiah 61, verses 1 and 2. The Spirit of the Sovereign Lord is on me, because the Lord has anointed me to proclaim good news to the poor. He has sent me to bind up the brokenhearted. That word for bind up is restore. To restore the brokenhearted. To proclaim freedom for the captives. And release from darkness for the prisoners. To proclaim the year of the Lord's favor. So what was broken that Jesus came to restore? Notably, two major things that Jesus restored through a single act of God in Jesus dying for us on the cross. The first thing is that Israel was broken. They had a broken religion. Clearly, Jesus was at loggerheads with Israel's religious leadership because they had turned relationship with God into a religion, a system of rules and regulations that distracted the people from what God was really after. And it had been that way right since the prophets, Isaiah, Amos, Joel, Jeremiah. We see God warning the people of their sin. The second thing that was broken was us. Us in what any generation we might be. Originally, if we go back all the way to creation, we were created to walk with God in perfect unity. Creator God and created man were in perfect harmony. But man sinned. We know the story. By deciding to exchange the eternal communion with God to follow a worthless deception. They literally sold what they could not lose to obtain what they could not keep. They gave away their communion with God and exchanged it for a selfish lie. The result is that death entered our world, entered the picture. And never again in Scripture do we read that God fellowshipped and walked in the cool of the day with his people. How desperately brokenhearted Adam and Eve must have been. And the only way forward for a loving God was to repurchase his creation through the redemption that he bought on the cross, and then to restore the relationship back to its original state. Christ always had restoration in mind. He wanted to redeem his people, to purchase them back. And then through a process, restore them back to their original state. 2 Corinthians 3:18 says, and we, with veiled faces, contemplate the Lord's glory and are being transformed into his image with ever increasing glory, which comes from the Lord, who is the Spirit. Isn't God's redemption beautiful? Jesus' beautiful restoration was bought on the cross. And he restored both things in one move. He restored Israel, not into earthly dimensions, but into heavenly dimensions. And you can read the whole of Galatians, but listen to what Paul says right at the end of Galatians in chapter 6, 14 to 16. Paul says, may I never boast except in the cross of Christ, through which the world has been crucified to me, and I to the world. Neither circumcision nor uncircumcision means anything. What counts is the new creation. Clearly, Paul recognized that the wall of separation between Jew and Gentile was gone. And then he nails it home with this next sentence: peace and mercy to all who follow this rule, to the Israel of God. Who is the New Testament Israel of God? Anyone like Paul who boasts in the cross that we have just celebrated tonight. We are all the new Israel. That's why I say God beautifully restores both us and Israel in one beautiful move. When God revealed the future to our father Abraham. Remember the song we used to sing? Father Abraham had many sons. If you remember that song, you're really old, like me. Okay? Many sons had Father Abraham. I remember singing it at youth group over and over and over. But it was true. Abraham probably didn't have a clue what God had in mind. But that's exactly why the number can't be counted. The Israel of God is as vast as the stars in the sky. Israel hasn't been replaced. It's come into its beautiful fulfillment. It's bigger and better than Abraham could ever have hoped. So what about us today? Point number 3. The opportunity for restoration is continually with us. One of my favorite scriptures that I love to pray over people is Joel chapter 2 and verse 25. Joel speaks the words of God, saying to the people, I will repay you for the years the locusts have eaten, the great locust and the young locust, the other locusts and locust swarm. I thought there was just one kind of locust. Obviously not. There's all kinds of locusts. My great army that I sent among you. Israel had gone through a 4-year drought, and as part of that drought, then came this massive horde of locusts. One locust by itself is absolutely nothing. But hundreds and thousands of them is another story. Even today, with all our modern farming methods, farmers are still aware of the damage that locusts can do. They eat every bit of vegetation in sight. And God says, through the prophet Joel, that he will restore what the locusts have eaten. Maybe you've had seasons in your life that look like the locusts have been there. Fruitless years. For all the effort that you put into it, whatever it was, you have nothing to show for it. Painful years because of injury or sickness, and you were hoping to perform in some way, maybe in sports or some way, but because you were sick, it never happened, and now the opportunity is gone. Loveless years, where for one reason or another, you felt isolated and alone. Prodigal years, where you just wasted the opportunities through rebellion, through being arrogant, or just willfully ignorant. Misdirected years. Through no fault of your own, you just chose to go down a certain path. You even maybe thought that this is the way that I believe God is leading me. And it just turned into a dead end. And then there's the Christless years. Everyone who comes to Christ as an adult, after living a fair amount of their life, wishes that they'd had the opportunity to come to Christ earlier in their lives. Because all years without Christ, all Christless years are locust years. You know, in my life, I can point to a number of places where God has restored what the locusts have eaten. I'll share with you one. It's over a long period of time. In 1983, it was in my second year of matric. They were the two best years of my school career. Got to go to 2 matric dances. But I spoke at a children's camp. You call them a children's camp, eh? Yeah. I spoke at a camp. And one of the leaders came to me afterwards and said to me, Mark, I think you should seriously think and pray about going into the pastorate. I didn't feel that it was right at that time, and so it took another 6 years, and by that time I was married. I was working as a manager in Checkers, believe it or not. And then in 1990, I was called as a youth pastor at a church in Margate. And that began a 14-year run of being in the ministry, in full-time pastoral ministry. And then I stepped out of full-time pastoral ministry for about 13 years. It's a long story, and I'm not going to go into it. But it wasn't because I'd lost a sense of call. And so I still took the opportunities that I was given as someone who was not full-time to do what ministry I could. And it tended to be opportunities to do pre-marriage ministry and marriage ministry. But it really looked as if my full-time years of pastoral ministry were over. In fact, I sold most of my theological books. And then Trevor phoned me in 2016. And in 2017, I came to Lighthouse. And as I said to someone the other day, I can't remember who it was, it may have actually been Trevor, it almost feels what God has restored in these years almost feels like God was leaving his best to last. It was absolutely amazing. That's beautiful restoration. I could tell similar stories in my financial situation, in my health. God's brought restoration. So to whom is this promise given? Does God restore everyone's locust years? Not really. If we read in verse 17 of Joel chapter 2, it points to those who come to God weeping, saying, "Spare your people, O Lord." In other words, God hears the prayer of those who come to him asking him for mercy. Asking him to be merciful to them. And the second thing I see in this verse is that ultimately they must want God's name to be glorified. Joel says towards the end of verse 17 that it doesn't make sense that the nations say, "Where is their God?" No, to Joel, he's thinking that the nations need to go, "Wow, what a God. Look how he restores." It's to God's name that we bring honor. So how does he do this? How does he make everything beautiful in his time? How does he restore locust years? Because once time is gone, it's gone. You can't do time over again. How do you restore locust years? When we deliberately deepen our communion with God, he has a habit of working miracle maths into our fruitfulness. What do I mean by that? Well, you remember the parable of the sower in Matthew chapter 13. Remember, Jesus speaks about the seed that falls on good soil. Such a person in deep communion with God bears fruit 100-fold, 60-fold, and 30-fold. Do you realize that 3 years of fruitfulness at 100-fold would give you the same as 10 years at 30-fold? God restores what the locusts have eaten and gets the fruitfulness so that 7 years can be immaterial just like that. That's God's beautiful restoration. Are you seeking for beautiful restoration in your life? Submit yourself to Jesus as fully as you can. Ask Him to show you His mercy and confess it for His name. Seek for God to be honored in all of this. And watch for God to make things beautiful in His time. I can't tell you when it'll happen. And for some people, it happens in heaven. Because that is our ultimate reward. That is our ultimate restoration. A great example for me of now restoration is Dave Stevens. At the moment, 10:07, he'll be boarding his plane overseas in about half an hour, I think. He spoke this morning. But even before Dave spoke, I had prepared that I was going to share this. 2 years ago, I remember having breakfast with Dave. And he poured out his story to me. And I want to tell you that there's very little that shocks me. I've pretty much heard it all, but Dave tested my shock reflex. Yet in the last 2 years, I believe, we've all seen it. Dave has produced a harvest manyfold over. And it never came easy. He made it look easy, but it's never easy. Because he was prepared to sit in New Creation, the program that Niels runs, and in community group, and listen to very honest and helpful feedback. He was prepared to throw himself behind missions and put his hand up for community leadership. He led divorce care. He went through divorce care. He committed himself to work. He restored relationships that had gone south. And he swallowed his pride. And God made something very beautiful in Dave's life. We're going to miss him. He's restoring back to Dave what he lost and more. I'm glad he's reaping well. Pity the lady was in Latvia, but I hope one day we'll see them back here. I know that Debbie and I have the privilege, we're going to be doing pre-marriage with them over Zoom, which is going to be a wonderful opportunity. And he initiated that, not me. What about you? What are you initiating?